So, George, let me let you, in your own words, tell the audience a little bit about what you do at BAE.
So what I do at BAE is I am overarching for enterprise architecture for end-user computing, mobility, and special projects assigned as such around mobility. That include anything from your extranets to how you get secure collaboration from the mobile device, from your extranet, or from your desktop. It's a very overarching role. It's the governance and design architecture for everything that we're doing, both internal and external for our customers, like the federal government or the UK government or any of the other myriad of governments that we do work with.
And how long have you been at BAE?
I've been at BAE roughly now about 6 months.
6 months, okay.
Prior to that, I was over doing a lot of the mobility work with the U.S. Coast Guard around good dynamics and deploying that for about 6 years.
Okay. So you've been on the inside and now you're on the outside,
yes.
Kind of, right? Playing that whole Beltway partnership. Now, talk about BAE a little bit about mobility, and how long has BAE been doing mobility? Give them a little history about how the whole thing got started.
BAE's been doing mobility like the rest of the Beltway bandits out there, probably for the last 15 plus years. They started off on BlackBerry, like everyone else did, and then they moved and said, we need to get something. We need to do something. BlackBerry's dying. What can we do? So they went out there and they did a market research analysis, and they said, good at the time, was the best of the breed. This is what we need to use. So they have been they moved quickly to good initially, and then, like most companies, they reached an exodus, and then they slowly have been trickling the last remaining users over to good.
Okay. And just relative to that, so how long ago did you start making that transition? And was it mainly, Exchange and Bez server that you had before good?
It was a Bez server and it was Exchange, and it's been going on now for the last 3 years. They've moved the bulk of the users, and now I have to preference this. BAE is actually broken up into BAC Inc., which is the U.S. arm, and then BAC PLC, which is the worldwide arm, which has the offices such as UK, Australia, Saudi Arabia, India, spread out. And each of those offices work independent of Inc., though there is an effort underfoot to collaborate and bring everyone under one umbrella from a licensing perspective in the prospective markets that they're in, doing business in. So the rules I have to follow in the US are totally different than the rules I have to follow in the UK. And they have to take that into account and separate those rules and governances accordingly.
Do you use policies to do that?
We do.
Yeah.
We have to adhere to all the FSMA we write our policies based upon FSMA and the governances around the NIST special publication 800-53, as the U.S. says, but then we also have different policies we have to adhere to that are in the U.K. and different policies for Australia or Saudi Arabia, and that's the unique challenge there. We don't have one set of policy. We have several policies we have to adhere and get this perfect model.
Now, by the way, for the audience, we are going to take questions near the end, so you should start queuing some of those up. But a question for the audience, maybe a poll. George indicated a little bit relative to some of the legacy. How many of you still have Bez server at your enterprise? And that's probably about 45-50%. Yeah. So that's always an interesting discussion relative to all the things that are going on in the market. Now, here's a question relative to BA, which can be a sensitive question. How are you handling BYOD, bring your own device? What's going on, and are there differences US and UK?
There most definitely are. In the US, BYOD, we really can't do it. The federal government has said, we do not want to allow our data sitting on a privately owned device. A lot of that comes down to laws and regulations that state if this device has a compromise from data spill, I must take that device from you and I must destroy it. The recent Supreme Court ruling that came out about 2 weeks ago adds another wrinkle to BYOD and a different level altogether. They said this personally owned device, that private data, you can't get to it. You can't even look at it unless you have a court order. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks and months what the legal department says. They're just now starting to get the grasp on what does that Supreme Court ruling really mean for BYOD, at least in the US. Now, over in the other markets, they're more open to BYOD. They like it. They feel there's cost savings and cost benefits. But at the same time, they have to play, what the US rules are versus what the UK rules are versus the Australia rules. And we've even done it to a different level of saying, does everyone get BYOD, or are we only going to give this to a select few?
And just relative to that, so I'm sure that, relative to, the overall enterprise architecture for mobility, that's played into it, right? So there's just basically a US you're just not doing.
Right, we can't. I mean, the government said, we will not give you a contract if you have BYOD. We don't want to get involved in a data spill. They said, no. We tried it, and we did. Then government said, no, we're not allowing it for us. We don't want to allow it for our federal contractors.
Interesting. Just a show of hands, how many of you have a BYOD program at your firm? Not too many. What, 10? 10 hands? Okay, so a lot of federal contractors here, obviously, in the audience. Now, another thing relative to, again, you got different businesses, you're in the security business. How do you segment users relative to both policy and actually, how you deploy? So you can talk a little bit about users and classified, unclassified, and how you've designed your architecture to support that.
So, for the most part, classified users, we actually can't maintain a mobile infrastructure for that. For our case, we actually have to get the permission of the US government, and they will give the classified mobile devices. For an unclassified architecture, it's pretty straightforward based upon business case, business justification, and your role in the company. We don't want to give a device to everyone. Generally, we try and keep it about 15 to 20% of the total workforce. And I can tell you, looking at other agencies I've dealt with over the years, DOD in particular, they looked at it initially and they said, we have a 70% mobile deployment, and they said that's way too high. Coast Guard said we had a 30% mobile deployment, and they said it was too high. And they actually, last year and a half, they went through a cost cutting and got it down to about 15%. So everyone is looking at that and saying, does everyone really need this mobile device? And what percentages of our overall infrastructure do we want to be mobile devices?
Well, we could flip that around too and say, well, what if you looked at the mobile, the idea of mobile first, and if they gave up another device? Has that come up at all relative to certain?
It has, but even then, we're saying only a small subset of users can have two devices. The mobile executive, the mobile warrior, they can have two devices. But if you're mostly stationary, you're a shop floor worker or whatever, do you really need a mobile device? What's the benefit to the company for you having that mobile device? One of the things that's the key to BAE is the work-life balance. So they say, do we really need you to have this device to be able to contact you on your off day or when you're off at home? They value that, and they say, if you don't really need it, we're not going to give you one.
Well, and by the same token, you have some people that are probably in some very high-pressure jobs because you're making defense systems, right? And I've worked with aerospace firms where literally it's a 24/7. So some of those production people, they probably have to have.
They do. There is a small subset that have to.
Right.
But they really want to get it to who's actually needs it. We don't want to give it to everyone because it's not cost-effective. We can't afford. The federal government can't afford it. Private industry can't afford it. DOD's finally realizing they can't afford it. You have to draw the line in the sand. You have to define what is the acceptable number of users.
By the way, for the audience, how many of you have more than two devices? Raise your hand. Laptop. See, now that is almost, 95% of the audience. So relative to what you just said relative to that, so have you deployed tablets? Can you talk about tablets versus smartphones?
We have deployed tablets and smartphones, and even there we say, if you're an exec, you can get whatever you want. We really can't control that too much. But now when I get down to the directors and lower, generally I say you get either a tablet or you get a smartphone. You're not getting both. And even with the tablets, starting to go to this extent of saying, your tablet's your PC. You're not getting a laptop.
So, and then we've seen that too, where maybe sometimes they keep the old laptop, they don't get a new one.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting. Relative to the whole phablet, the larger, Samsung has those devices now. Apple's going to copy them. What you've seen, that form factor, does that come into play at all?
It does.
The mixed hybrid kind of.
But we're really putting that more onto the business and saying what they want to spend per the employee.
Right.
How much does the business want to spend on this vice president versus this program manager? The vice president may be able to buy that $700 Note 3 or Note 4 when it comes out, where the program manager, he may only get the Galaxy Note 3. It's almost a free device. Or the iPhone 4 or iPhone 5, whatever. We put a cost determination on, your level in the company.
All right, so now we're going to start diving even deeper into some of the stuff that really is front and center, and it's some of the stuff that, and I'm based in Silicon Valley, that a lot of times enterprises, particularly commercial enterprises, don't want to talk too much about. I gave a talk last week to about 30 CIOs, and I gave them a live demo of one of the websites where you can actually see all the attacks that are going on, all the cyber attacks around the world. And it's quite spectacular when you see a live animation of that. So tell me a little bit about how you're dealing with cybersecurity, both from an architecture perspective and also from, both, intrusion detection, also, basically making sure that the bad guys don't do bad stuff.
So we do have a very big presence in cybersecurity. For the most part, we are focusing a lot on the thick, well-connected devices. Mobile devices still add a very interesting dynamic for cybersecurity, because how do I track a device that if I turn on tracking, it's going to kill the battery and kill the usefulness. If I have it disconnected, I don't know what the device is going on. How do I do all that? And the best way we've gotten to figure it out is, let's do some monitoring on these devices. Let's get call log recordings from the carriers. Let's start getting the analytical data that we can collect on these devices if they're an online or offline state, and then analyze it on the back end. But even that is such a rudimentary level. The industry's still evolving around that. Yeah. And it's still to be determined where it's going to be.
So one of the prevailing theories around that is if we do more than the other guy, then they may leave us alone. Is that one of the things that I mean, relative to what level of effort do you put forth? Because they're trying to get actually your IP.
Right. So we're going to do the best that we can, but we're going to do a intelligent point of view of what's the cost-effective way of doing it, because at some point there is a loss on the investment on the device, whether it's the usefulness of the device, the cost of the implementation to monitor it, and then the other problem is we're getting to a tipping point of almost collecting too much data on what's going on these devices, so I have to have a throng of people in the back room just to analyze what's going on with my devices. And they're already swamped today with desktops and thick connects. What's going to happen when we start collecting the same amount of data on mobile devices?
Well, and by the way, I think it goes without saying that, I mean, I'm assuming you're probably 100% of your mobile footprints are good secured.
Of the goods, okay, so our footprint is, of the newer devices, it's all good. We still have legacy BlackBerry floating around.
Right.
But as we get those devices off the environment, it is good going forward, at this time.
Yeah, I've been actually out on the road with some of the good executives, John Dasher, and we did a lot with some of in certain cities where there's a lot of banks, and we saw a similar kind of data point relative to just, basically for mobile devices, adding that extra layer so that you're not necessarily, if the OS, mobile OS provider messes up on one release, you're not kind of stuck,
Right.
exposed,
And that's,
so to speak.
yeah.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit. And earlier this morning, we're talking about mobile apps. Can you talk a little bit about your approach, both architecturally to mobile apps, third-party mobile apps, and also internal development of mobile apps?
So we've started to look at mobile apps. Our footprint, at least at BAE, is not that large internally with mobile app development. What we were actually looking at is more of the COTS apps, the ISVs. Who can we leverage to get the stuff done? One of the problems we started seeing with that is, came across my desk earlier this year. I want to be able to print mobily from a device securely to a corporate printer. And what came across is I can do it today, but if my infrastructure for printing is, spread out and like most corporations are, it's cost prohibitive to actually do some of this stuff that's out there because, these companies are there to make money and do business, which I understand, but for me to be offering up mobile printing to a, BAE to, let's say, 250 users, we came out, it was going to cost us $50,000 a year. So, the bigger problem we look at mobile apps is the cost affordable justification of some of the apps.
Yeah. So you're not doing a lot of mobile app development right
We're
now?
not doing it, but we want to, but it's the cost.
Yeah. So for the audience, I know you were asked earlier this morning, any of you doing internal development mobile apps? Show of hands. Looks like 10%. So now I would just say, based on being out across a number of the other cities on the commercial side, most people were raising their hands. In fact, there's some pretty good discussions about that relative to the pluses and minuses and the best practices around that. But relative to the COTS, off-the-shelf mobile apps, you got some of their partners here. Are you using any secured version of some of those COTS apps, like good secured with the good wrapper?
We've started looking at those, and that is the requirement we have to use going forward because we're protecting federal data. We have to adhere to the FIPS standard. So if we have a mobile app, we're going to have to be wrapped in the good container fully, from data at rest on the device to data in transit to the location where the data is residing. So I'll go to printing back a good example. The architecture Breezy has, what's one we looked at, it's a good app, is they have two architectures, an on-prem and an off-prem. The on-prem does, securely transfer it, one way.
Right.
The off-prem, again, does it securely in the container, but the off-prem is more enticing because it actually has a better security than the on-prem at this time.
Interesting.
And it's critical, that security component, because we need to keep that security first mindset for the data in transit and data at rest.
So what about your business users that they've got their mobile device and you got a rogue user that goes and downloads a bunch of apps that aren't approved? Does that get to you, or is that really the business that has to fix that as far as internally?
We don't 100% track that.
Okay.
Because I'm going to go to, in the past everyone says we need to. The recent Supreme Court ruling is now going to say, I don't know if I can actually track what you guys install on those devices anymore. At least on the private side. On your corporate side, sure, I'll be able to track it, but I don't know if I'm legally going to be allowed to say, hey, John over there, he downloaded Angry Birds, and Bob over there, he downloaded the latest version of Netflix or some other app. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess the other thing that comes up, though, is that there are some of those apps that are being used as attack vectors. So
there are.
There might be a good,
Exactly.
To watch closely.
You have to watch it, and that's one of the things I like about Good from their app perspective is they force any independent software, ISVs, ISMs, to go through the Veracode process to validate that the app code is actually not doing something malicious. There's no one else that I'm aware of today in the mobile industry that's doing that.
Cool. So before we run out of time, we want to give the audience a chance to ask George some questions. So who would like to ask the first question? And I'll just note that early. Back in the back there? Yeah, there's a microphone.
Good morning. It's Lieutenant Aaron Green here from the Coast Guard. George, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. Is it on?
You're going to have to restate that.
Good morning. This is Lieutenant Aaron Green from the Coast Guard. I just wanted to ask, what is BAE doing with some kind of secure file share?
Good question. At this time, BAE is still trying to determine what I call expanded services are on the mobile environment. Expanded services can be collaboration. Expanded services can be secure file share and transfer, printing, any of these ISM apps that are out there. We've looked at several of them. We haven't actually made a final decision on, what the direction is. Because, one of the things I'm looking at that just came out is Microsoft said, hey, we're putting an Office version out for Android and iOS. So I have to ask the question, does it make a good business sense to use a Polaris Office, an Office Square, or any of those, independent, small companies, or does it make more sense to standardize on the Microsoft Office mobile app for Android and iOS and start leveraging those type apps?
Yeah, so it's the best of breed versus some of the entrenched legacy providers, yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing I would just point out relative to the file share and mobile content thing, and John had a nice panel at the Cronus and Excellion. There are nasty things that goes on with the actual files themselves, and a PDF has been one of the number one attack vehicles. So if you have a file sync program that isn't secured, they're not doing the scanning of the files before it syncs it, and you've got it set up and configured to auto sync, that malware is just auto-delivered. So
it does.
You have to be really careful from a implementation that you understand how those applications really work. Another question from the audience? Who else wants to ask George a challenging question? Over here.
You wanted a challenging question? I'll give you one. My name's Eric Tam. I'm with Starpoint Corporation. So you were talking about NIST. So my question is, with your relationship with NIST and NSA, what are your thoughts about the backdoor? And have you seen any pushback from any of your customers, particularly international customers, because of that?
We have seen some pushback on, some of the backdoors that are out there, but that's where the big cover is, that secure container. How can we secure the data out? If we can't secure the data outside the container, we're trying to pay less attention to that and pay more attention to that secure container. So the NIST. Some of the other NIST guidelines they're putting forth, some of them actually don't have ways to meet them at this time. So we do have concerns over that, and we're still trying to evaluate how we're going to do that in the future moving forward.
That's a good question. Everybody follow that answer? Other question? We're in our lightning round. Okay, well, I've got one. So we talked about a lot of the different things. We talked about your approach. We talked about the fact that you've got a policy, you've got multinational considerations. It's a lot of stuff. And when you got to BAE, how much work did you have to do on the architecture and the policy to kind of get it all in sync? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can, and that's something that's an ongoing process. It's not something that is going to be solved, what's going on. And this right now is, I'm going to say, we're going through what we're calling is the Snowden effect.
Yep.
The policy that we thought before I got there was acceptable, the governments are changing, so cloud computing, when I talk about that. I can have a data center for the US and the data has to reside there. But now when I talk about the EU says, my data has to reside in an EU data center. It can't reside in a US data center. So we're starting to see the policies shift the same way with around mobility, where they're saying US has to reside in the US, has to be, this policy. We're not going to allow the EU policy shift into here, even though it may make sense from a corporate strategy perspective. We can't. The federal government of both sides, aren't allowing it. We can pick and piece together. Here's the best of this, and here's the best of this that marry up, and we can set these as standards across the board. But then we have other areas that, the cloud, where, while we may agree with these up here, down here, this segment, we have to have a slightly different policy here and a slightly different policy here, and it's still changing. It's, I'm going to say, I don't expect the policy that we see today will be in effect 100% a year from now, because something's going to change. It's like the mobile industry. It's changing every 6 months. It's
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Big move to Internet of Things that's coming this fall. So the last question that I have for you, which is really kind of sharing your wisdom as an enterprise mobile architect with our audience. What's your best advice relative to what they should leave here to do relative to making sure they can succeed with mobile?
Don't get locked into what the big companies are saying. Actually look at the architecture. I'll give the 3 examples. I'll give the big 3 right now in mobile is MobileIron, AirWatch, and Good. And if you look at the big 3, and I take away some of the nice features that are nice to have, they're all doing their own niches. Good is a lot more secure in some areas. AirWatch may have a better interface and some better content delivery in some areas. And then you have MobileIron, which is trying to compete in that space, but they have holes themselves. The question goes is, look at the architecture of how they're doing it. Don't just pay attention to what the marketing people tell you, because at the end of the day, it's the privacy of the data that's the most important. And you have to consider, how am I going to secure that fully from data in transit to data at rest? And when they talk about expanded services, how am I going to secure it securely from app 1 to app 2? There are companies out there that don't fully encrypt that tunnel when it goes from app 1 to app 2. They decrypt it and then they encrypt it again.
Great. Well, George, I want to thank you very much. Audience, let's give George Blankenship of BAE Systems a big hand.